It is 1 in the afternoon. You have been awake for approximately 7 hours, and inside your brain, something has been accumulating since the moment you opened your eyes this morning, a molecule that your neurons produce as a byproduct of every thought, every decision, every conversation, every moment of sustained attention you have maintained since your alarm went off. 7 hours of thinking have left a chemical residue in the fluid surrounding your neurons, and that residue is now binding to receptors across your cortex, progressively dimming the signal strength of the networks that have been keeping you sharp since breakfast. Simultaneously, something else is happening that has nothing to do with how hard you worked this morning. Your circadian clock, the 20,000 neuron timekeeper deep in your brain, is executing a scheduled dip in its alertness signal. This dip occurs at approximately 1 in the afternoon every day, regardless of whether you ate lunch, regardless of whether you slept well last night, regardless of whether the morning was easy or brutal. The dip appears in every human population ever studied. It appears in people who skip lunch entirely. Not fatigue from the morning, a trough in the alertness curve that your biology produces every 24 hours, as predictable as the trough that occurs at 3 in the morning. Two forces converging at 1 in the afternoon. One is accumulation, 7 hours of chemical residue building in the spaces between your neurons. The other is timing, a circadian valley that your brain creates on schedule. Together they produce the state you are in right now, the afternoon fog, the heaviness behind the eyes, the feeling that your thinking has become slightly less precise than it was 3 hours ago. You have a choice. You reach for caffeine, which will block the receptors where the residue is binding, covering the signal without clearing the chemical. Or you close your eyes for 20 minutes and let your brain do something that no drug, no supplement, no amount of willpower can replicate. Molecule accumulating in your brain is adenosine, a degradation product of the energy currency that fuels every neural process. Each time a neuron fires, each time a synapse transmits, each time your prefrontal cortex maintains a thread of working memory, the energy molecule is consumed and adenosine is released as waste. The adenosine accumulation and circadian gating, the sleep timing discussion described for nighttime, the two systems that drive the evening descent into sleep operate here as well, converging at 1 in the afternoon instead of 10 at night. 7 hours of continuous waking cognition have produced a concentration of adenosine that is measurably higher than it was at 8 in the morning. Adenosine binds to receptors throughout the cortex and the arousal centers. The binding is inhibitory, it reduces the firing rate of the neurons it attaches to. As concentration rises across the day, cortical neurons fire more slowly, processing becomes less efficient. The subjective experience is fog, reduced sharpness, difficulty sustaining attention, not a failure of effort. The direct electrochemical consequence of 7 hours of neural metabolism. Simultaneously, your prefrontal cortex, the most metabolically expensive region of the brain, responsible for planning, impulse control, and emotional regulation, has been running at high demand since morning. Imaging studies show that prefrontal fuel consumption declines across sustained wakefulness more steeply than in other cortical regions. The prefrontal cortex at 1 in the afternoon is metabolically depleted, its fuel supply drawn down faster than the brain's delivery system can replenish during continuous waking operation. Depletion has specific consequences that most people attribute to personality rather than biochemistry. The comment that irritated you at noon but would have rolled off at 9 in the morning. The decision that felt overwhelming at 1:30 but obvious at 10. The patience that was available this morning and is no longer available now. These are not character defects. They are fuel depletion in the region that regulates emotional reactivity, the region that imaging studies show is the first to degrade under sleep pressure and the first to recover after brief sleep. Afternoon alertness dip is one of the most misattributed phenomena in daily life. People blame lunch. They blame carbohydrates. They blame the warm office. They blame Monday. Dip is circadian. It is generated by your master clock as part of the alertness curve that every human produces across 24 hours. The curve has two troughs, a deep one at approximately 3 to 4 in the morning and a shallower one at approximately 1 to 3 in the afternoon. The afternoon dip appears in subjects who have eaten nothing. It appears in subjects who ate protein-only meals. It appears in subjects living in constant environmental conditions with no time cues. Not a response to food, A feature of the circadian program, core body temperature drops by approximately a third to a half of a degree during this afternoon window, a miniature version of the temperature decline that precedes nighttime sleep onset. A small pulse of melatonin, too subtle to produce drowsiness on its own but measurable in blood, appears in the early afternoon. The circadian system is briefly creating conditions that lower the threshold for sleep entry, as if offering a scheduled window for daytime rest. This is the window. It opens at approximately 1 in the afternoon and begins closing by 3. Within this window, the combination of accumulated adenosine pressure and circadian alertness trough produces the lowest sleep onset latency of the daytime. You fall asleep faster at 1:30 than at 11 in the morning or 4 in the 11 afternoon. The body is opening a gate. Now, what caffeine does to this state, because understanding what caffeine cannot do is the fastest way to understand what sleep must do. Caffeine's molecular structure is similar enough to adenosine to fit into the adenosine receptors. But caffeine does not activate the receptor. It occupies it without triggering the inhibitory signal. The receptor is blocked. Adenosine cannot bind. The sleepiness signal is muted. Masking, not clearing, the adenosine is still in the fluid. Its concentration continues to rise. The neurons that should be receiving the slow down signal are not receiving it, but the chemical that would deliver the signal is still accumulating. When the caffeine is metabolized, half-life of approximately 5 to 6 hours, the adenosine that has been building behind the blockade floods onto the now unblocked receptors simultaneously. The caffeine crash, often worse than the original fatigue, because the adenosine concentration is now higher than it would have been without the delay. Caffeine does not restore prefrontal fuel levels, does not clear adenosine from the extracellular space, does not produce the neural oscillations that transfer memory, does not reduce blood pressure, does not normalize stress hormone levels. Caffeine does one thing: it temporarily hides the adenosine signal. Everything else that the 1 in the afternoon brain needs requires the state that caffeine is specifically designed to prevent. Afternoon coffee is a postponement of the problem with compound interest due by evening. You lie down. You close your eyes. Within 30 to 90 seconds, the fast, desynchronized brain waves of waking cognition slow into the relaxed rhythm of closed-eye rest. Your visual cortex reduces its metabolic demand by approximately 80%. Prefrontal activity decreases. The brain networks that serve external attention begin yielding to the networks that serve internal maintenance. Not sleep yet, but the metabolic shift has already begun. The fuel that was being consumed by executive function is becoming available for restoration. Within 5 to 10 minutes, the brain waves slow further. You have entered light sleep. Muscle tone decreases. Heart rate begins declining. Breathing slows. Your thalamus, the relay station that gates sensory information to the cortex, begins filtering more aggressively. External sounds that would have registered clearly 3 minutes ago now require higher intensity to break through. The cortex is being partially disconnected from the environment. And then, at approximately 10 to 15 minutes, the event that justifies the entire 20 minutes occurs. Brief bursts of oscillatory activity appear, rapid oscillations lasting half a second to a second and a half each. These are sleep spindles, the defining feature of the sleep stage you have just entered, and the most functionally significant neural event that occurs during a short nap. Sleep spindles are generated by a specific circuit, a thin shell of inhibitory neurons surrounding the thalamus. These neurons fire in a coordinated burst, suppressing the relay neurons beneath them. The relay neurons, released from the suppression, rebound and fire a synchronized volley to the cortex. The cortex responds. The inhibitory shell detects the response and fires again. The loop oscillates 11 to 15 cycles per second for half a second to a second and a half before the circuit dampens and resets. During each spindle burst, your memory center and your cortex are briefly coupled. High-frequency bursts in the memory center replaying recently encoded traces are temporally locked to the spindle oscillations. The coupling is the mechanism. Memory traces are transferred from temporary storage to long-term cortical networks during the spindle window. The spindle is the transfer protocol. The memory center sends. The cortex receives. The timing of the spindle synchronizes the transfer. A finding by Manda and colleagues at UC Berkeley demonstrated that the number of spindles produced during a nap directly predicted the degree of learning capacity restoration afterward. More spindles, more clearing of the temporary memory buffer, more capacity for new learning in the afternoon. The spindle count was the mechanism, the nap was the delivery vehicle. This is what caffeine cannot do. Caffeine blocks adenosine receptors. It does not generate the oscillatory loops that couple memory center to cortex. It does not transfer traces from temporary to long-term storage. It does not clear the memory buffer. The process requires the specific neural state of stage 2 sleep. No drug replicates it. No waking activity produces it. That sequence, the inhibitory shell firing, the relay neurons rebounding, the memory center coupling its replay bursts to the spindle rhythm, is the protocol that collapsed the distinction between sleep and idleness for me. Spindle-mediated transfer has a consequence for the afternoon that most people attribute to the nap refreshing them in a vague general sense. The consequence is specific. The memory buffer is partially cleared. Capacity for new encoding is restored. Even ultra-short sleep, as brief as 6 minutes, containing spindles produced measurable improvement in subsequent memory performance compared to an equivalent period of waking rest. As Lal and colleagues demonstrated, the benefit was not relaxation, it was not reduced fatigue. It was the spindle-mediated transfer creating space in the buffer for new information to enter. Post-nap cognitive performance improves in a pattern that reveals which brain systems were restored. Reaction time improves. The adenosine cleared from the arousal centers allows faster cortical processing. Perceptual discrimination improves. The thalamic gating that filtered sensory input during sleep resets to waking sensitivity, producing sharper sensory processing than the pre-nap state. And creative problem-solving improves through a mechanism the spindle transfer may explain. Traces that were encoded separately during the morning are transferred to cortical networks during the nap, and the cortical networks integrate them in ways that the memory buffer's sequential storage could not. Connections between ideas that were stored as separate events in the buffer become visible once they are consolidated in overlapping cortical networks. The aha moment after a nap, the solution that arrives as you wake, the connection you could not see before you slept, may be the cortical integration of separately encoded morning experiences made possible by the spindle-mediated transfer. Position matters during the nap, and the reason connects to the autonomic shift that produces the cardiovascular benefit. Lying flat produces faster sleep onset and deeper stage 2 sleep than napping upright in a chair. The mechanism is hydrostatic. Lying flat redistributes blood from the lower extremities toward the core and the brain, reducing the cardiovascular work required to maintain cerebral perfusion. Heart rate drops further. The parasympathetic shift is larger. The blood pressure reduction is more pronounced. Chair napping, head back, legs down still produces spindles and adenosine clearance, but the autonomic shift is smaller because the cardiovascular system is still working against gravity to maintain upward blood flow. When lying flat is not available, office, airport, car reclining as far as possible captures a partial hydrostatic benefit. Elevating the feet improves the redistribution further. The physics is simple. Reduce the gravitational demand on the cardiovascular system, and the parasympathetic shift during sleep is amplified. Brain is not the only system that responds to 20 minutes of sleep. Below the neck, the autonomic nervous system undergoes a measurable shift within the first minutes of sleep onset, and the shift is qualitatively different from what waking rest produces. Lying on a couch with your eyes closed, scrolling mentally through your afternoon schedule produces some parasympathetic activation. But the thalamic gating that sleep onset triggers the partial disconnection of the cortex from the environment permits a depth of autonomic shift that waking rest cannot reach. During waking rest, the cortex remains connected. It continues processing ambient sound, light through closed eyelids, body position, background thoughts. The processing maintains a baseline of sympathetic tone that prevents the full parasympathetic shift. Sleep onset removes the cortical processing that maintains that baseline. The autonomic system drops to a depth that the waking brain's continued environmental monitoring will not permit. Heart rate decreases by 10 to 20 beats per minute during a nap. Sympathetic nervous system activity, the fight or flight tone that has been elevated since morning, decreases. Parasympathetic activity increases. Blood pressure drops. Data presented by Manolis and colleagues at the European Society of Cardiology showed that midday napping was associated with an average reduction of 5.3 millimeters of mercury in 24-hour systolic blood pressure, a magnitude comparable to low-dose blood pressure medication or moderate salt restriction. If you are over 45, this is not a marginal benefit. Sustained elevated blood pressure is the primary modifiable risk factor for stroke and cardiovascular disease. A daily 20-minute reduction in sympathetic drive, repeated across months and years, produces cumulative cardiovascular protection that the body cannot obtain from any other source during waking hours. The autonomic system does not fully shift to parasympathetic during waking rest. It requires sleep onset, the thalamic gating, the cortical deactivation, the specific neural state of light sleep to produce the magnitude of cardiovascular shift that the blood pressure data reflects. Stress biochemistry normalizes during brief sleep. Stress hormone reversal from a single nap was demonstrated directly by Farot and colleagues. A 30-minute nap opportunity reversed the elevated cortisol and disrupted immune signaling caused by a night of sleep restriction. One nap did not merely reduce subjective stress. It reversed measurable biochemical markers of physiological stress. Immune function responds to the autonomic shift. Your body's first-line defense against virally infected and precancerous cells, the natural killer cells, decline measurably after sleep restriction and partially recover with supplementary daytime sleep. The immune system reads the autonomic state. Sympathetic dominance suppresses immune surveillance. Parasympathetic dominance enhances it. 20 minutes of parasympathetic shift during a nap is 20 minutes of restored immune function. Well, there is a reason this matters more with each passing decade, and the reason is not weakness. Two things change with age that make the afternoon nap more valuable, not less. Nighttime deep sleep declines. Beginning in the late 30s and accelerating through the 50s and 60s, the total amount of deep, slow-wave sleep obtained per night decreases from approximately 20% of total sleep time in young adults to approximately 5 to 10% by age 60, as Carrier and colleagues documented. The growth hormone pulses, the synaptic maintenance, and the brain waste clearance that depend on slow-wave depth are all reduced. Nighttime repair becomes less complete with each passing decade. This means the daytime maintenance window becomes proportionally more important. If you are 45 and your nighttime slow-wave sleep is already declining, you arrive at 1 in the afternoon with more unfinished repair business than a 25-year-old. The adenosine accumulation may be similar, but the overnight clearance was less complete. The afternoon nap is compensatory, picking up maintenance that the shortened nighttime window left unfinished. Your memory buffer also shrinks. The temporary storage region that spindles help clear loses approximately 1 to 2% of its volume per decade after 40. A smaller buffer fills faster. The experience of walking into a room and forgetting why, reading a paragraph and retaining nothing, losing a word mid-sentence, these become more frequent because the temporary buffer has less capacity and fills to functional limit earlier in the day. Spindles during a daytime nap clear this buffer. If you are 55 with a memory buffer 10 to 15% smaller than it was at 30, the clearing function of a midday nap is proportionally more important. The spindle-mediated transfer removes traces from a buffer that was closer to capacity when the nap began. Cultural narrative says napping is for the elderly because they are weak. The physiology says napping is more valuable after 45 because the nighttime maintenance system is less complete and the daytime buffer fills faster. The nap is an adaptation to a changing biological landscape precisely calibrated to compensate for the specific deficits that aging produces in nighttime sleep architecture and memory buffer capacity. And then the deadline. Because the window does not stay open. The circadian afternoon dip, the trough in the alertness signal that opens the nap window, begins closing by approximately 2:30 to 3 in the afternoon. After this point, the circadian alertness curve begins rising toward its late afternoon peak, typically 5 to 7 in the evening. Napping after 3 means sleeping against the rising alertness signal rather than with the falling one. Sleep onset takes longer, sleep quality is lower, and critically, the adenosine cleared during a late nap reduces the sleep pressure that the body needs to initiate nighttime sleep at the appropriate hour. A well-timed early afternoon nap clears enough adenosine to restore function without significantly depleting the evening sleep pressure reserve. A late afternoon nap clears adenosine at a point where the body cannot rebuild enough pressure before bedtime. Difficulty falling asleep at 10 in the evening. Delayed sleep onset. Reduced first cycle slow wave depth. Before 2 in the afternoon is the boundary between the circadian window that supports supplementary daytime sleep without disrupting nighttime architecture and the zone where daytime sleep begins competing with nighttime sleep for one adenosine resource. The gate opens at approximately 1. It closes at approximately 2:30 to 3. Within that window, 20 minutes of sleep clears adenosine, generates spindles, transfers memory traces, restores prefrontal fuel, shifts the autonomic balance toward parasympathetic, reduces blood pressure, normalizes stress hormones, and supports immune function without stealing from the night. After the window, every one of those benefits comes with a cost to nighttime sleep quality. Identical nap, different timing, different outcome. The circadian gate does not negotiate. NASA study published by Rosekind and colleagues measured this in pilots. A planned 26-minute nap opportunity during long-haul flights produced a 34% improvement in reaction time and a 54% improvement in alertness compared to no nap. Controls. The naps occurred in the circadian afternoon window. The improvements were measured on tasks with safety-critical implications, the kind of cognitive performance where the difference between a nap brain and a caffeine-masked brain is not academic. Siesta cultures arrived at this independently. The Spanish siesta, the Italian riposo, the Greek misimeri. Each culture built a schedule around the circadian afternoon, dipped the largest meal at midday, followed by a rest period that coincided with the biological window the circadian clock was already providing. The 5-pathway drowsiness the post-meal discussion described blood redistribution, gut hormone, glucose pathway, tryptophan competition. Gut neuron activation converges with the circadian dip to produce the strongest daytime sleep pressure of the 24-hour cycle. The cultures that built rest into this convergence were not lazy. They were biologically literate without knowing the biology. The 20-minute boundary matters because of what happens after 20 minutes. By 25 to 30 minutes, many nappers descend into slow-wave sleep, the deep sleep stage characterized by high-amplitude delta waves. Waking from slow-wave sleep produces sleep inertia, a period of grogginess, impaired cognition, and disorientation lasting 15 to 30 minutes. The inertia is the cost of going too deep. The 20-minute nap avoids this cost because it keeps you in stage 2 spindle-rich, restorative, easily exited without descending into the slow-wave depth that produces the groggy awakening. If you have ever napped for an hour and woken feeling worse than before you lay down, the mechanism is here. You descended into slow-wave sleep. You were pulled from it by your alarm or by a noise. Your cortex was still operating in the deep sleep mode when waking demands arrived. The resulting confusion, the disorientation, the inability to think clearly, the 20 minutes of uselessness after waking is sleep inertia from premature slow-wave interruption. The 20-minute nap avoids the entire problem by timing the sleep to the stage where the highest functional benefit occurs with the lowest awakening cost. Set an alarm. 20 minutes from the moment you close your eyes, not from the moment you lie down. The 5 to 10 minutes of transition time before sleep onset is not sleep and should not count against the total. If you fall asleep within 5 minutes, which the circadian window makes likely, you will spend 10 to 15 minutes in the spindle generating stage that produces the clearing, the transfer, the restoration. If you take longer to fall asleep, 10 minutes is common for people unused to napping. The reduced spindle window still produces measurable benefit. Even 5 minutes of stage 2 sleep generates spindles. The benefit scales with duration up to approximately 20 minutes, then plateaus until the slow wave threshold introduces the inertia cost. There is a combination strategy that exploits the caffeine half-life to compound the nap's benefit rather than compete with it. Drink a cup of coffee immediately before closing your eyes. Caffeine takes approximately 20 to 30 minutes to absorb through the gut lining and reach the adenosine receptors in the brain. During those 20 minutes, you are asleep, the spindles are firing, the adenosine is being cleared through sleep's metabolic processes, the memory buffer is transferring. When you wake at the 20-minute alarm, the caffeine is arriving at receptors that the nap has already partially cleared of adenosine. The caffeine blocks the remaining adenosine that the nap did not fully clear. The result is additive, sleep-based clearing plus caffeine-based blocking. Neither alone produces the combined effect. Rayner and Horn demonstrated that the coffee-then-nap combination outperformed both coffee alone and nap alone on subsequent driving performance tasks. Bright light exposure within the first minute of waking accelerates the transition from sleep physiology to waking physiology. The light reaches the cells in your eyes that synchronize your circadian clock, suppressing the residual melatonin from the afternoon micropulse and signaling the arousal system that the maintenance window is closed. If you nap in a dim room, stepping into bright light immediately on waking produces a sharper cognitive transition than waking in the dim environment. The light is not optional for people who experience post-nap grogginess. It is the fastest available signal to the circadian system that waking has resumed. Regular napping at a consistent circadian time produces a training effect on sleep onset. Your brain learns the schedule. After 2 to 3 weeks of consistent early afternoon napping, sleep onset latency decreases. You fall asleep faster because the circadian system begins anticipating the nap and prepositioning the conditions that support it. The melatonin micropulse may strengthen. The adenosine clearance mechanisms may upregulate. The improvement in sleep onset is not psychological, it is circadian conditioning, the master clock incorporating the nap into its daily program, the way it incorporates nighttime sleep onset after consistent bedtime scheduling. People who say, "I can't nap," are often people who have never napped consistently enough for the circadian conditioning to establish. The ability to nap is trainable. The circadian system is waiting for the pattern. That convergence, adenosine clearance, spindle-mediated memory transfer, prefrontal restoration, and autonomic rebalancing, all occurring within a 20-minute window that the circadian clock opens once per day and closes by mid-afternoon, is the maintenance schedule that ended the assumption I had carried for decades that the afternoon slump was a problem to override rather than a window to use. If you take blood pressure medication, the nap's cardiovascular benefit compounds the medication's effect. The combination produces a larger total blood pressure reduction than either alone. If you experience lightheadedness on waking from a nap, the mechanism is the nap's parasympathetic shift compounding your medication's effect. Standing slowly after waking allows the cardiovascular system to readjust. The lightheadedness is a reason to transition from lying to standing gradually. The blood pressure benefit is real, and the transition cost is manageable with awareness. It is 1 in the afternoon. The gate is open. The adenosine is high. The circadian trough is arriving. Your prefrontal cortex is running on depleted fuel. Your memory buffer is approaching capacity. Your sympathetic nervous system has been elevated for 7 hours. Your blood pressure has been at its waking level since morning. Your immune surveillance has been suppressed by the sympathetic tone that sustained attention requires. 20 minutes. Eyes closed. The spindles will fire. The buffer will clear. The fuel will restore. The blood pressure will drop. The stress hormones will normalize. The immune cells will resume their work. All of it in 20 minutes that caffeine cannot provide, that waking rest cannot produce, that willpower cannot substitute for. The gate closes by mid-afternoon. Whatever maintenance was not completed in the window will wait for tonight, where it will compete for time in a nighttime sleep architecture that, past 45, is already producing less slow-wave depth than it did a decade ago. 1 window, once per day. The body has been opening this gate every afternoon for as long as your species has existed.